At 06:47 on June 6, 1944, the sea was flat as a sheet of pewter, the moon still a tired coin in the west, and Commander Samuel Dealey stood cramped in Harder's conning tower, watching 3 Japanese destroyers cut a white scar through the night toward his periscope, like wolves that had finally scented blood. He was 37, seasoned by 5 war patrols and 18 enemy ships already sunk under his keel. And what he saw that morning was an arithmetic problem the Imperial Navy had never expected to face. Minazuki, Hayanami, and Tanaka's steaming fast, sonar and radar sweeping. Orders to kill the American submarine that for 3 weeks had turned their supply lanes into a graveyard. While Dealey, calm, audacious, and dangerous because he thought differently about risk, would change the rules of submarine warfare in a way that would ripple far beyond the men aboard his boat. For years, submarines had played a timid role against destroyers. A destroyer could make 35 knots on the surface. A sub could barely manage 9 submerged. Between Pearl Harbor and spring 1944, Japanese escorts had sunk 14 American boats, and in those months no American submarine had sunk a destroyer while both ships were in active combat posture. The common-sense map of the ocean said run, dive, hide. But Dealey read the map like a gambler and saw an edge where others saw only danger. And on April 13th, when the destroyer Ikazuchi charged Harder's position at flank speed, every officer expected the submarine to flee. Dealey ordered flank, straight at the destroyer. And at 900 yards, Harder fired 4 torpedoes in a spread. 2 struck amidships. The destroyer blew apart and sank in 5 minutes. The terse radio transmission that followed expended 4 torpedoes and 1 destroyer, circulated like contraband through the submarine force. A new lesson in bold print. Admiral Suimu Toyota did not smile, for Japan had lost 23 destroyers in the first half of 1944, and Tawi Tawi, where Operation Argo planned to gather the mobile fleet to intercept an American invasion force, was suddenly a precarious anchorage. The Japanese concentrated their mobile fleet in late May at Tawi Tawi. 4 battleships, including the monstrous Yamato, 9 carriers, 15 cruisers, 28 destroyers, the largest assemblage since Midway, and American codebreakers, reading the signals, knew the danger. Admiral Charles Lockwood sent Harder to prowl those waters for targets of opportunity, and for 9 days she slipped through the ocean undetected, until the morning 3 destroyers and a patrol plane found her, and then the hunt reshaped itself into a contest of nerve and cunning. Dealey studied Minazuki through the glass and decided to do what few captains would: swing Harder's bow straight at the attacker, exhale the customary submarine fear of being rammed, and execute the down-the-throat attack. You aim torpedoes at an oncoming destroyer's bow and then dive beneath her keel. If the torpedoes fail, you face depth charges at your position, or a brutal ramming at 750 yards. But if they connect, the destroyer breaks the assumption of invulnerability, and the hunter becomes the hunted. At a range of 980 yards, Harder fired. Explosions shook the hull. 40 seconds later, light fixtures shattered, and when Dealey raised periscope depth, the sea was a smudge of wreckage and oil where Minazuki had been. The other 2 destroyers scattered and dropped depth charges like a frantic drumbeat, but for the moment Harder kept hunting. Admiral Toyota, furious, ordered more destroyers out, poured resources into hunt groups, and Japanese patrol planes scoured the skies every 20 minutes. But Harder had taught a lesson, and Dealey was not done. On June 7th, surfacing to charge batteries under a moon-blank sky, he caught yet another destroyer on the surface, Hayanami, closing at 28 knots. The Japanese captain, exhausted and expecting no surface attack, had been told to return to base, and his radar operator misclassified the contact until it was too late. Dealey throttled Harder to 21 knots on the surface, closed, and at 2,300 yards, fired 4 torpedoes. 2 struck aft, and the ship's stern came off as if cut by a giant hand, rolling and going under with her screw still spinning. The sea took 147 souls that night, and the Imperial Navy's confidence in its anti-submarine shield eroded inch by aching inch. Admiral Toyota ordered 8 more destroyers from escort duty into hunter-killer mode, and their orders were stark. Maximum aggression. Find that submarine and kill it. Dealey wanted to see how many he could sink before Japanese captains adapted. On June 8th, he shadowed patterns, watched predictable zigzags that gave him 30 seconds after each 8-minute turn, fired at Tanakas as she closed, and watched a bridge strike and a forward magazine detonation rip a ship apart, felt the vibration of the explosion through the hull as the bow and stern vanished into the dark, and tested the metal of the escort, who then dropped depth charges and failed to break him. 3 destroyers in 3 days, and the Japanese commanders began to understand that a new predator stalked their ships. On June 9th, at periscope depth 12 miles southwest of Tawi Tawi, Dealey peered through the glass and saw 4 destroyers in line abreast, sonar pings like percussion over his head, and he had 8 torpedoes left. The second ship in column presented itself with a steady bearing, and at 1,800 yards, he fired 3 torpedoes that all struck within seconds of each other, the explosion lofting debris 300 feet into the air, while the rest of the formation converged. Depth charges began their hellish arithmetic overhead. 23 in the first 10 minutes. Emergency lights sputtering, bulkheads groaning. A pipe burst in the forward torpedo room, men braced with a discipline carved by fear and habit. But 2 hours later, the destroyers withdrew and Harder rose to a sea that no longer felt safe. 4 enemy destroyers sunk in 4 days. Harder had burned 60% of her diesel and had perhaps 3 more days before having to withdraw to Fremantle. But her 4-day spree had wider consequences than tonnage sunk. Admiral Ozawa, commander of the mobile fleet, calculated the risk and prepared to move his forces early. Operation Ogo required precise timing and reconnaissance, yet reports of destroyers being sunk off Tawi Tawi compelled Toyota and Ozawa to weigh anchor ahead of schedule, scattering carriers, delaying reconnaissance, and creating a chaotic formation in the northern Marianas that Admiral Raymond Spruance's fleet would later find on June 19th, in a moment forever known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In other words, Harder's actions had created a strategic ripple. Destroyers sunk meant fewer escorts for carriers. Early departure meant disorganized air cover, and disorganization on the Japanese side meant catastrophe in the air. Dealey had no inkling of the larger storm his torpedoes had triggered. He was simply a man at the periscope, making decisions that a few hours later would amplify into history. Harder limped back to Fremantle on June 26th, and Admiral Lockwood, eyes on patrol reports, awarded Dealey the Navy Cross immediately, and asked the question that haunted every Maverick commander. Can you do it again? Dealey's answer, give me torpedoes and I'll sink 10, was equal parts bravado and a promise rooted in method. His crew trained on down-the-throat tactics, and by late July, every submarine commander in the Pacific had studied Harder's patrol reports, learned the timing, the psychology of destroyer captains who assumed submarines would run, and began to mimic the aggressive approach. Between June and August 1944, American submarines sank 14 Japanese destroyers, applying variations of Dealey's method. By August, Harder, freshly rearmed, left Fremantle for a Wolfpack patrol with Hardo and Hake, and the trio crushed convoys off Palawan Bay and the west coast of Luzon before fortune turned. On August 24th, Harder's luck ran thin. Sonar echoed. Escorts CD-22 and PB-102 closed and zeroed in after radio intercepts had revealed the Wolfpack's operations. Harder crash-dived as the escorts closed, and CD-22's depth charge patterns bracketed her position perfectly. Detonations within 50 yards cracked the pressure hull. Seawater flooded aft compartments. Bulkheads failed. Compressed air systems fought in a losing battle. And within minutes, Harder imploded under pressure that had been holding back the sea as if the ocean itself had chosen to swallow her. 79 men died that morning, including Samuel Dealey and Calvin Bull. And the brutal irony, the man who had remade submarine tactics, was now a chapter in the cost of daring. Marked the war in a way no medal could soften. The news rippled through commands. Lockwood suspended operations in the area, and the Navy Department later announced Harder lost with all hands. Japan's escorts claimed the victory. Admiral Toyota praised CD-22's crew, while the larger effect of Harder's earlier patrols remained. The mobile fleet had been forced to depart Tawi Tawi days early. Admiral Ozawa's carriers were undersupplied and ill-prepared when American carrier planes found them. And what might have been a much closer fight turned into a lopsided slaughter of Japanese air power. 3 carriers sunk, hundreds of aircraft lost, a Navy's air arm crippled. The Marianas battle could trace an important thread back to the audacity of a single submarine skipper who broke the conventional script. Between December 1941 and August 1944, American submarines had already sunk 1,314 enemy ships, but very few were warships. Most were merchant tonnage, cargo ships, tankers, transports. And conservative doctrine had treated attacking warships as reckless. Day proved otherwise. Submarines could fight warships and win by exploiting expectations. His down-the-throat tactic relied on a simple psychological paradox. Destroyer captains expected submarines to run, and that expectation produced hesitation and split-second error when confronted by audacity. 12 seconds of hesitation could be the difference between a wake and a burial. From June through December 1944, a dozen American submarines adapted Day's aggression. Tang, Trigger, Barb, Flasher, and others scored similar kills. And by war's end, American subs had claimed 38 destroyers, among other warships, many attributed to bold night surface attacks or close-range torpedo shots inspired by Harder's blueprint. There was cost. Success bred adaptation, and by late 1944, Japanese destroyer commanders developed countermeasures, turning away to let torpedoes pass ahead, slowing to absorb torpedo tracks, coordinating formations to present crossfire. And American boats paid with losses. Tang was lost when one of her own torpedoes ran circular and struck her. Dato ran aground, and Harder herself met the fate risks of the new doctrine. Admiral Lockwood faced an agonizing choice between caution and annihilation of the Japanese merchant fleet. He chose aggression and accepted higher submarine losses for unprecedented strategic payoff. Between January and August 1945, submarines sank 437 merchant vessels and 53 warships, starving Japan of oil, raw materials, and the ability to move men and supplies. Industrial strangulation that bent the curve of the war. Samuel Day never saw the endgame he had helped set in motion. He died 3 months after his most famous run, killed by the very anti-submarine machinery his tactics had provoked and improved. And yet his doctrine survived. The down-the-throat approach is taught at the Naval Academy to this day, not because modern wire-guided torpedoes make it necessary, but because the principle endures. Surprise, audacity, and psychological exploitation can unbalance an opponent who relies on assumptions. Harder's patrol reports live in the Naval History Archives. Every message a line in a ledger of learning. They show a commander who iterated, who refined solutions after each contact, and who taught his crew to act in the moment. On March 27, 1946, President Truman presented Day's widow with his Medal of Honor on the White House lawn, a public acknowledgement of a sacrifice and a tactical revolution. The Navy later named a destroyer escort in his honor, and Harder earned unit citations and 6 battle stars. Her motto, "Hit 'em harder," entering the lore of submariners like a battle hymn. The men who served aboard Harder came from a cross-section of America. Farm boys, factory hands, students, and they paid a terrible price. Submarine service carried the highest casualty rate of any branch. 22% of those who served in subs died. A statistic that threads through families and communities to this day. Calvin Bull, radio operator and Bronze Star recipient, perished at 24. John Mao, who survived and later rose to admiral, spent a lifetime recounting their stories until his death in 2010. The last survivor of Harder, Paul Bryce, died in 2022, and with him died the last living voice of that patrol. In 2024, 80 years after Harder went down, an exploration team led by Tim Taylor and the Lost 52 Project found her wreck upright in the South China Sea at 3,750 feet, 12 miles west of Dowell Bay, the conning tower showing depth charge damage, and the hull a testimony to the violence that ended her. The discovery closed a litany of questions for families and transformed a sonar contact into a place of mourning and memory, a protected war grave where no salvage will be permitted, but where the story of daring, calculation, triumph, and loss now has a place on the sea floor that future generations can point to and say, "This is where men changed the calculus of naval war." The tactical revolution Harder started had costs and consequences. It drew enemies into overcompensating, stretched escorts thin, and in a broader sense contributed to the conditions that made the Battle of the Philippine Sea such a disaster for Japan. But it also exacted a price in lives and in painful lessons. The same audacity that sank destroyers also invites counter-adaptation. And Harder's end is a stern reminder that innovation in war is a double-edged sword. Yet the historical ledger is clear. When your opponent expects you to run, charging can be a superior strategy. A lesson men in the hull learned with their hands on valves and their ears full of explosions. When modern naval students study the down-the-throat attack at Annapolis, they do so to learn not a formula, but a way of seeing the battlefield. An enemy's doctrine contains a psychology that, if exploited, can yield disproportionate effects. Today, the Naval History and Heritage Command maintains Harder's patrol reports and Lockwood's dispatches. Commander Dealey's grave sits in Arlington, his stone a small, luminous punctuation in a forest of memory. And families gather each August 24th to remember men who died at ages barely older than boys. Those families, scattered across 38 states, carry the quiet burden of stories that must be told with the precise, aching detail the archive cannot provide. The sound of depth charges that cracked the metal like thunder, the smell of diesel and cooling oil, the tilt of the hull as it took a punch from the sea. The last words across a dying radio frequency. We tell these stories because numbers alone, 4 destroyers sunk in 12 days, 1 submarine lost with 79 souls, cannot carry the freight of what it is to decide in a conning tower that you will be the anomaly to rewrite history, and then to pay for it with blood. If this account moved you, if the blend of courage, calculation, and consequence resonates, remember the names: Samuel Dealey, Calvin Bull, John Mao, Paul Bryce, the 79 of Harder, and the countless unnamed who sailed under simple orders and did what navies require of their best: adapt, attack, and sometimes accept the cost.